Okay, so picture this. You're driving, right? Windows down, maybe some music on, just cruising, and bam. Your mind hits you with this totally out of nowhere thought. Like something so out there, it makes you hit the brakes and think, whoa, where'd that come from? That, my friend, is an intrusive thought in action. And that's what we're diving into today. We've got some really interesting research and personal stories you guys sent in that we're going to unpack.
It is kind of wild how many people have these thoughts, but nobody really talks about them. It's like this whole hidden part of our mental world.
Seriously. So let's bring it out in the open. One story that really got me was Sarah's. She's a graphic designer, and she has this intense fear of hitting someone while she's driving. It gets so bad that she's constantly checking her mirrors, even pulling over to make sure she didn't hit anyone, which, as we'll get into, is pretty common with intrusive thoughts.
What's interesting about Sarah's story and intrusive thoughts in general is how different they are from just like everyday worries. It's not just, did I lock the door? This is different. It's powerful, often disturbing stuff that goes totally against who the person really is.
Yeah, so even though Sarah's a careful driver, right, someone who clearly values safety, her brain throws her this curveball, this fear of causing harm. It's almost cruel the way our minds can do that.
It really is. And that's key here. The content of these thoughts clashes with who the person is deep down. That disconnect, that's a huge part of why it's so disturbing.
Like looking in the mirror and seeing some messed up reflection staring back. Super unsettling. But why does this happen? What's going on that these thoughts just pop up uninvited and unwanted?
Well, it's rarely just one thing. It's usually this mix of things, psychological stuff, neurological stuff, even things in our environment. Like take the psychological side. Stress and anxiety. Those crank up the volume on these thoughts big time.
So when we're already on edge, our brains kind of go into overdrive and these scenarios start popping up.
Exactly. Our mental capacity is maxed out. And these thoughts, they slip through. And we got to remember some mental health conditions, things like OCD, depression, PTSD, they can make these thoughts way more frequent and intense.
So it's like the condition itself creates this breeding ground for intrusive thoughts to take hold.
Exactly. Take OCD, for example. Obsessions, a lot of times, are intrusive thoughts, and then people do compulsions to try and quiet the anxiety. It's this nasty cycle. Then there's the neurological side, the whole world of neurotransmitters. When these chemical messengers, especially serotonin, dopamine, and glutamate, are out of whack, it can really mess with how our brains regulate mood, process info, which could explain why some folks are more prone to these thoughts.
So there's a real biological basis here. It's not just all in our heads then. Can you tell me more about these neurotransmitters and how they actually affect how we think?
So serotonin is really interesting. It plays a big part in how our brains filter information. Well, when serotonin levels are good, our brains can sift through all the noise and get rid of those irrelevant or disturbing thoughts, keep them from taking over. But if those levels get disrupted, like they can with anxiety or depression, the filters get weak, we're wide open to those intrusive thoughts.
So kind of like a spam filter on your email. When it's working, you see what you need to see. But when it's broken, it's all junk mail all the time, stuff you never asked for.
Perfect analogy. Those chemical imbalances can totally mess with our brain's natural filtering, and boom, we're more vulnerable.
Psychology, brain chemistry, it's all connected. Amazing how much is going on under the surface, huh?
Totally. And just like what's going on inside us matters, so does the outside world.
You mean environmental factors?
Yeah.
I know for me, if I'm sleep deprived, my brain feels foggy. Who knows what kind of thoughts are brewing in there when that happens?
For sure. Sleep deprivation, that's a big one. When we're exhausted, our prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that helps with decision-making and controlling impulses, it's not at its best. That makes it harder to fight off those intrusive thoughts, to just dismiss them.
Like our internal nope button stops working when we're sleep deprived.
Exactly. And let's not forget about major life changes, stressful stuff that can send our minds reeling. Losing a job, a death in the family, even something like a global pandemic. It's no wonder those events can trigger a flood of intrusive thoughts as our brains try to process it all.
So it's this whole mix, right? What's going on inside us, our brain chemistry, and the world around us.
Yeah.
All of it impacts these thoughts.
It's crazy, right? How all this comes together. And speaking of complex, let's go back to those stories you shared. They really give us a look into how different these intrusive thoughts can be.
Totally. We were talking about Sarah and her fear of hitting someone while driving. It's like these thoughts, they grab onto our deepest fears, those what-if scenarios that can keep us up at night.
You said it. Our brains, they're trying to process potential dangers, but sometimes they just get stuck, and those fears get blown out of proportion.
And it's not always about physical harm, right?
Yeah.
We have Michael, he's a CEO, and he talked about having these thoughts during important meetings. Like he pictures himself just blurting out confidential company info, or even worse, having a total meltdown in front of everyone.
Michael's experience shows how these thoughts can target our sense of control, especially when we feel pressure to keep it together.
It's his worst nightmare playing out, that fear of being exposed, humiliated.
And what's so powerful about his story and all the ones you sent in is how open and honest they are. It takes guts to talk about this stuff, especially because people don't always react well.
Yeah, and that makes me think of Elena's story. She's a teacher, happily married, and out of nowhere, she gets hit with these thoughts of being attracted to a coworker.
Right.
Totally goes against everything she believes in, her commitments.
Elena's story shows a really tough part of intrusive thoughts, the shame and guilt they can cause, especially when it's something taboo, something that goes against our morals.
It's like our brains don't care about what's socially acceptable or right. Even if we don't choose these thoughts, we feel so isolated, ashamed.
Exactly. It's this secret world inside our heads that we're terrified to share, even with the people we're closest to. And that fear, it stops people from getting help.
It shows how anyone can have these thoughts. Doesn't matter what you do for work, who you're in a relationship with, how you present yourself to the world, intrusive thoughts don't discriminate.
Exactly. Which brings us to Daniel. He's a firefighter, so he faces danger every day. But after one really bad rescue, he kept seeing images of it, replaying those moments over and over.
Like his brain couldn't escape it, trying to process this intense experience, but getting caught in a loop of what ifs.
Exactly. And this is where trauma and intrusive thoughts connect. When something traumatic happens, our brains kick into survival mode, and those memories, they stick with us. Intrusive thoughts, in a way, they're our brain's way of making sense of the trauma, trying to find a way to store it safely. But sometimes that process gets messed up, and the memories come back as intrusive thoughts, flashbacks.
So these thoughts, even though they're disturbing, they could be a sign that our brains are trying to heal, trying to work through these experiences.
That's a really good way to look at it.
Yeah.
And it's why getting professional help is so important when trauma is involved. A therapist can give you a safe space to process what happened and learn how to cope in healthy ways.
It's a good reminder that we don't have to go through this alone. There are people who get it, who understand how the mind works, and can help us through it.
Absolutely. And part of understanding is realizing that there are common themes to these intrusive thoughts. We've seen it in the stories, right? They often center around stuff that triggers strong emotions. Harm, control, fitting in, morality, death.
It's like those are the bullseyes on our brain's dartboard.
Love that. The specific content might be different for everyone, but seeing these common themes can help us feel less alone, less like we're the only ones dealing with this.
For sure. So let's break down some of these themes. We talked about thoughts of harming others, but what about this fear of losing control? We touched on it with Michael, but what are some other ways that pops up? We were talking about those themes, right? And how intrusive thoughts can really latch onto fears about control.
Absolutely. And it can be so much more than just like worrying about an outburst. Think about someone who's really meticulous, like an accountant. Suddenly they're hit with these thoughts of making huge mistakes, like ruining their client's finances. Or a new parent, terrified they'll drop their baby, even though logically they know they would never.
It's like their worst fears on repeat, just amplifying those anxieties about messing up and what might happen.
Exactly. And then you have those thoughts about like social acceptance. It taps into that fear of judgment, of being rejected. We saw it with Elena, but it can also be things like being afraid you'll say something totally inappropriate in public, or your body will betray you in some embarrassing way, or even just this constant feeling that everyone's judging you negatively.
Like their inner critic just goes on overdrive, throwing all these awkward worst-case scenarios at them, even when there's nothing to justify it.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are those intrusive thoughts that bring up death, our own mortality, or the thought of losing loved ones. Those can be really, really unsettling because it forces us to face this existential fear we usually try to avoid.
Like suddenly our brains are aware of just how fragile life is, and we get these what-if scenarios about death that we don't feel ready to deal with.
And that's where those cultural and societal things you mentioned come in. How these existential anxieties become intrusive thoughts. It can be shaped by how we were raised, our religion, even what's going on in the world around us.
It reminds us that this isn't happening in a bubble. These thoughts, they're connected to our lives, to the world we live in. But knowing all this, what can someone actually do if they're struggling? It can feel so lonely, so overwhelming.
You're right. It's so important to remember you're not alone in this. The first and probably the most important step is to reach out to a professional. A therapist can figure out if those intrusive thoughts are part of something bigger, like OCD, and help you find the right treatment.
So getting a real diagnosis is important because intrusive thoughts by themselves aren't a diagnosis, right? They're more like a symptom of something else that might be going on.
Exactly. And when it comes to treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, that's been super effective, especially for intrusive thoughts that are part of OCD.
I've heard of CBT, but how does it actually work?
Yeah.
I mean, these thoughts feel so involuntary. So how do you change that?
Great question. CBT isn't about making the thoughts disappear completely. It's about changing how you react to them, how you relate to them. It's about realizing that thoughts are just thoughts. They don't have power over you unless you let them.
So you shift from being afraid of them, from fighting them, to just observing them, accepting that they're there.
Exactly. One technique they use in CBT is called exposure and response prevention, or ERP. Basically, you gradually expose yourself to the things that trigger the intrusive thoughts. But instead of giving into compulsions or avoiding them, you sit with the anxiety until it fades.
So like with Sarah, with her fear of hitting someone while driving, with ERP, she might start driving in situations that trigger that anxiety. But instead of checking her mirrors or pulling over, she would just be with that discomfort, learning that the anxiety will go down, even without those safety behaviors.
Exactly. You're breaking that cycle of thought, anxiety, compulsion. You're retraining your brain to react differently.
It sounds really tough, but also, like, empowering.
It is. It shows how adaptable our brains are, that we can change and grow. Another helpful tool is mindfulness.
Mindfulness, so being present in the moment.
Yeah.
But how do you do that with thoughts that are so intrusive, often really disturbing?
With intrusive thoughts, mindfulness is about learning to see those thoughts without judgment, kind of like just watching clouds float by. You recognize that they're just thoughts, things your mind is creating, not necessarily the truth or what you really want.
So you don't get lost in the thought itself, you don't overanalyze it or fight it, you just notice it and let it pass without giving it power.
You got it. It takes practice and patience, but over time, it can help you create some distance between you and the thoughts. It's like learning to ride the waves of anxiety instead of letting them drown you.
I like that. And sometimes medication might be helpful too, right? Especially if these thoughts are part of a bigger issue like OCD or anxiety.
Absolutely. Meds like antidepressants, they can help with those underlying chemical imbalances that might be playing a role. It's about finding the right combination of things that works for each person.
So as we wrap up here, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
If you're struggling, please know you're not alone. Intrusive thoughts are incredibly common, and there is hope. Reaching out for help, exploring treatments like CBT or mindfulness, and remembering that you are not your thoughts, those are powerful steps toward feeling better.
I love that. And for everyone listening, we hope this deep dive gave you a better understanding of intrusive thoughts, where they come from, and the many ways to manage them. Remember, knowledge is power, and you have the strength to handle this. If any of this resonated with you, check out those stories and the research we talked about. Keep the conversation going. There's a whole community out there ready to support you.